The autumn of 1886 brought the worst storm Deadwood had seen in decades. Rain hammered the wooden rooftops like bullets, and lightning split the Black Hills sky with violent white scars. Silas McCree sat alone in Murphy's saloon, nursing his third whiskey of the evening, watching water cascade down the grimy windows in sheets. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it couldn't burn away the memories that haunted him. Memories of another storm, another child's cry, another failure that cost an innocent life. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now." "Hell of a night," muttered Murphy, the grizzled barkeeper, as he wiped down glasses with a dirty rag. "Rivers rising something fierce. Haven't seen it this angry since '71. Silas didn't respond. At 43, he'd learned that words were often wasted breath, especially when the past clawed at your insides like a wild animal. His weathered hands, scarred from years of rope burns and gunfights, gripped the glass tighter. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon like the voices of the damned. The saloon door burst open, and Deputy Marshal Thomas Brennan stumbled in, water streaming from his coat. His face was pale, eyes wide with panic. "Murphy, anyone seen Doc Holliday? We got trouble, big trouble." "Doc's been gone 3 days, you know that," Murphy replied. "What's got you spooked, Tom?" Brennan's voice cracked as he spoke. "The river, it's not just rising, it's broken through the north embankment. Half the lower town's already underwater, and it's heading for the main street fast." Silas's head snapped up. The lower town, that's where the poorest families lived, where children played in the muddy streets and mothers hung laundry between ramshackle buildings. His chest tightened. "How many folks we talking about?" Silas asked, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and silence. Brennan looked surprised to hear the notorious loner speak. "Maybe 50 families. Most got out when the warning bells started ringing, but—" He hesitated, wringing his hat in his hands. "But what?" Murphy pressed. "The widow Henderson's place. It's on the far side of Mill Creek. Bridge washed out 20 minutes ago. She's got her grandson with her, little Timothy. Boy's maybe 7 years old." Silas felt the blood drain from his face. 7 years old, the same age as— "Anyone tried to reach them?" he asked, standing abruptly. The chair scraped against the wooden floor with a harsh screech. "Sheriff Morrison sent 3 men. Current's too strong. Lost 2 horses already, and Jake nearly drowned trying to swim across. It's suicide, McCree." Through the saloon's windows, Silas could see the chaos unfolding. Townspeople ran through the streets carrying whatever belongings they could salvage. Horses reared and whinnied in terror as their owners tried to lead them to higher ground. The usually calm Black Hills River had transformed into a roaring monster, swallowing everything in its path. But above the thunder and wind, above the shouts of panicked citizens, Silas heard something that made his blood freeze. A child's scream, high-pitched and desperate, echoing through the canyon. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Brennan and Murphy exchanged glances. "Hear what?" the deputy asked. The scream came again, fainter this time, but unmistakable. A child calling for help. Silas's hands began to tremble. Not from fear, but from the memories flooding back. Another storm, another child, another moment when he'd hesitated too long. "I'm going after them," Silas announced, heading toward the door. "McCree, you're drunk and you're crazy," Murphy called out. "That water will kill you before you get halfway across." Silas paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "Maybe, but I won't sit here and listen to another child die while I do nothing." The words hung in the air like a confession. Both men stared at him, sensing the weight of some terrible history in his voice. "What happened to you, McCree?" Brennan asked quietly. "What's eating at you?" For a moment, Silas considered telling them. About Sarah, his 7-year-old daughter. About the flood in Colorado 3 years ago. About how he'd been too drunk, too slow, too broken to save her when the creek rose behind their cabin. About how her mother, Elizabeth, had looked at him with such hatred and disappointment that he'd left town the next morning and never stopped running. Instead, he simply said, "Some debts can only be paid in blood and courage, deputy. Tonight I'm settling mine." He stepped into the storm, and the rain immediately soaked through his coat. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet, but he pressed forward, his boots splashing through ankle-deep water that covered Main Street. Behind him, he heard Murphy and Brennan arguing about whether to follow him or alert the sheriff. As Silas made his way toward the river, the child's scream echoed again through the canyon, and this time he was certain. It was coming from the Henderson place, across the raging torrent that had once been Mill Creek. Lightning illuminated the scene ahead, a wall of dark water rushing between the canyon walls, carrying tree branches, debris, and the broken remnants of the wooden bridge. On the far side, barely visible through the rain, stood a small cabin with a single light flickering in the window. Silas reached the riverbank and stared at the churning water. It was easily 50 yards across now, moving fast enough to crush a man against the rocks. Any sane person would turn back. But as another scream pierced the night, weaker now, more desperate, Silas McCree began stripping off his coat and boots. He'd failed one child. He wouldn't fail another. The water was ice-cold and violent, but as he waded in, one thought burned in his mind. This time, he wouldn't be too late. The Black Hills River hit Silas like a freight train, knocking the breath from his lungs and spinning him downstream before he could gain his footing. The current was merciless, filled with debris that struck him like clubs. Broken fence posts, uprooted trees, and chunks of buildings torn from their foundations. He fought against the torrent, his powerful arms cutting through the water as he angled toward the far shore. 20 yards, 30. The distance seemed impossible. A massive log swept toward him, and Silas dove beneath the surface just as it crashed overhead. The underwater world was chaos, a brown, churning hell where up and down lost all meaning. His lungs burned as he fought his way back to the surface, gasping for air as another wave crashed over his head. "Help! Please, somebody help us!" The voice was clearer now, definitely a child's, and definitely coming from the Henderson cabin. But there was something else. An adult woman's voice, weaker, calling out in what sounded like pain. Silas's boots finally found purchase on the rocky bottom near the far shore. He hauled himself onto the muddy bank, coughing up river water and blood from where debris had cut his face. His entire body ached, but he forced himself to stand and run toward the cabin. The small wooden structure sat on a slight rise, but the water was already lapping at its foundation. Through the single window, Silas could see the flicker of candlelight and shadows moving inside. He pounded on the door. "Mrs. Henderson, it's Silas McCree. I'm here to help." The door opened, and Silas found himself face to face with a boy who couldn't have been older than 7. Timothy Henderson had his grandmother's green eyes, but they were wide with terror. Behind him, an elderly woman lay on a makeshift bed, her face pale and twisted with pain. "Mister, Grandma fell down the stairs when the water started coming," Timothy said, his voice shaking. "She can't move her leg, and the water keeps getting higher." Silas knelt beside Margaret Henderson, a woman he'd seen around town but never spoken to. Her left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. She was conscious but weak, her breathing shallow. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to get you and Timothy out of here," he said gently. "But I need to know, is there anyone else? Anyone who might be looking for you?" Her eyes focused on him with difficulty. Timothy's father. He was supposed to come for him today. But the storm..." She winced as another wave of pain hit her. "Where's Timothy's father now?" "Don't know. He works for Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, up at the mining office." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. Cornelius Blackwood was one of the wealthiest men in the territory, owner of half the gold mines in the Black Hills. He was also known for his ruthless business practices and his habit of making problems disappear. "What's Timothy's father's name?" Silas asked. James Henderson. He's been working for Mr. Blackwood for 6 months now." Timothy tugged at Silas's sleeve. "Mister, my papa was supposed to take me away today. He said we were going to California, just me and him. But he never came." Something cold settled in Silas's stomach. A father planning to take his child to California, working for a man like Blackwood, and then disappearing on the very day a flood would make it impossible to search for anyone. It felt like more than coincidence. The water outside had risen another foot, and Silas could hear it beginning to seep under the door. They had minutes, maybe less, before the cabin would be completely flooded. "Timothy, I need you to be brave for me," Silas said, looking the boy in the eyes. "I'm going to carry your grandmother, but I need you to hold on tight to my belt and don't let go no matter what happens. Can you do that?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Are we going to die, mister?" The question hit Silas like a physical blow. It was the same question his daughter Sarah had asked him 3 years ago, and he'd lied to her then, told her everything would be fine. This time, he chose honesty. "I don't know, son, but I promise you this. I won't give up fighting until we're all safe." Silas carefully lifted Mrs. Henderson, trying to ignore her cries of pain as he shifted her broken leg. She was heavier than he'd expected, and he knew the return journey across the river would be nearly impossible carrying her. As they stepped outside, the full fury of the storm hit them again. The water was now waist-deep around the cabin, and the current was strong enough to knock a man down. Worse, Silas could see that the river had risen even higher. The distance back to town was now at least 70 yards of raging torrent. "Hold on tight, Timothy," he called over the wind. They waded into the flood, and immediately Silas knew they were in trouble. Misses. Henderson's weight threw off his balance, and the current was stronger than before. Timothy's small hands gripped his belt with desperate strength, but Silas could feel the boy's feet losing contact with the bottom as the water deepened. Halfway across, disaster struck. A section of roof from some destroyed building came spinning downstream like a battering ram. Silas saw it coming but couldn't dodge while carrying Mrs. Henderson. The debris slammed into them, and suddenly they were all underwater, tumbling in the dark current. Silas felt Timothy's hands slip from his belt. "Timothy!" he screamed, surfacing and spinning around frantically. Mrs. Henderson was unconscious in his arms, dead weight that threatened to drag them both under. But somewhere in the churning water, a 7-year-old boy was drowning. For a split second, Silas faced the same choice that had haunted him for 3 years: save the person in his arms or risk everything to save the child. Last time, he'd chosen wrong. Last time, he'd hesitated. This time, he didn't think. He placed Mrs. Henderson on a floating piece of debris and dove after Timothy. The boy was 20 feet downstream, his head barely above water, his small arms flailing weakly. Silas swam harder than he'd ever swum in his life, fighting the current that wanted to sweep them both away. His fingers closed around Timothy's shirt just as the boy went under. He hauled Timothy to the surface, and the child coughed up water, gasping and crying. "I got you, son," Silas whispered. "I got you." But when he looked around for Mrs. Henderson, his heart sank. The debris she'd been on had been swept downstream, and she was nowhere to be seen. In saving Timothy, had he doomed the grandmother? As they struggled toward shore, Timothy clinging to his neck, Silas heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of hoofbeats on the far bank, barely audible over the storm. Someone was watching them from the shadows, someone who didn't want them to make it back alive. Silas dragged Timothy onto the muddy riverbank, both of them coughing up the foul water of the Black Hills River. The boy was shivering violently, his lips blue from cold and shock. Behind them, the torrent continued its rampage, but there was still no sign of Mrs. Henderson. "Grandma!" Timothy cried out, trying to stand on unsteady legs. "Where's Grandma?" Before Silas could answer, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Through the driving rain, he could make out 3 riders approaching from the direction of town. Something about their deliberate pace, the way they spread out as they rode, set off every instinct Silas had developed during his years as a gunfighter. "Timothy, get behind that boulder," he ordered quietly, drawing his Colt .45 from its waterproof holster. "Don't come out until I tell you." The riders stopped about 30 yards away, just at the edge of the lamplight from town. The lead rider was a tall man in a black coat, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. When he spoke, his voice carried easily over the storm. "Well, well, Silas McCree should have known the famous gunslinger would stick his nose where it don't belong." Silas kept his gun ready, but not raised. "Don't believe we've been introduced." The man laughed, a cold sound that mixed with the thunder. "Name's Marcus Steele. I work for Mr. Blackwood, and you just made a very expensive mistake." "How's that?" "That boy you just saved? He wasn't supposed to survive tonight." Neither was his grandmother. Hell of a thing, natural disasters. So unpredictable, so final. The pieces clicked into place in Silas's mind. James Henderson found out something he shouldn't have, didn't he? About Blackwood's operation. So you killed him and planned to let the flood take care of the witnesses. Steele's horse shifted nervously in the rain. James Henderson was a fool who thought he could blackmail Mr. Blackwood. Some people never learn that certain knowledge comes with a price. What did he find out? The gold mine payroll robberies that have been plaguing the territory. Turns out they weren't random attacks by outlaws. They were inside jobs, orchestrated by Blackwood himself. He'd rob his own payrolls, collect the insurance money, and then use his political connections to blame it on Apache raids or drifters. Silas felt sick, and Henderson had proof. Henderson was Blackwood's bookkeeper. He kept records of everything, the fake insurance claims, the payments to the men who staged the robberies, even the bribes to territorial officials. Stupid bastard thought he could use it to secure a better life for his boy. So you killed him. We made him disappear. His body's at the bottom of an old mine shaft where it'll never be found. The plan was simple. Let the flood take the old woman and the boy, and there'd be no one left who knew what Henderson had discovered. Timothy's small voice came from behind the boulder, barely audible over the storm. "They killed my papa?" Silas's jaw tightened. The boy had heard everything. "Stay down, Timothy." Steele drew his gun, and his two companions followed suit. "Nothing personal, McCree, but you've seen too much. And the boy, well, loose ends have a way of becoming problems." 3 against 1, Silas observed. "Blackwood must really want this kept quiet. Mr. Blackwood is a thorough man. He doesn't leave anything to chance." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in stark white light. In that brief moment, Silas saw something that changed everything. Mrs. Henderson, alive and clinging to a piece of debris about 50 yards downstream. She was conscious, and she was watching. But Steele had seen her too. "Well, I'll be damned," the gunman said. "Looks like we got ourselves a bonus. Boys, take care of the old woman first. Can't have her floating into town with stories to tell." One of the riders spurred his horse toward the river, drawing his rifle. Silas had seconds to act. "Timothy, when I say run, you head straight for town. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. Find Deputy Brennan and tell him everything you heard." "But what about you?" "I'll be right behind you, son. I promise." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But sometimes lies were the kindest truth you could offer. Silas stepped out from cover, his Colt raised. "Steele!" The gunman turned just as Silas fired. The bullet caught Steele in the shoulder, spinning him around in his saddle. The other 2 men opened fire, their shots going wide in the storm and darkness. "Run, Timothy, now!" The boy sprinted toward town as Silas dove for cover behind a fallen tree. Bullets splintered the wood around him as he returned fire. One of Steele's men cried out and fell from his horse, but the third rider was already circling around to flank him. Silas rolled to his left just as a rifle bullet gouged the earth where his head had been. He came up firing, and his shot took the flanking rider in the chest, dropping him instantly. But Steele was still alive, still dangerous, and he was riding hard toward the river where Mrs. Henderson struggled in the water. Silas ran after him, reloading as he moved. The muddy ground was treacherous, and twice he nearly fell. Ahead, Steele raised his rifle, aiming at the helpless woman in the water. "No!" Silas shouted, firing on the run. His bullet struck Steele's horse, and the animal went down hard, throwing its rider into the mud. Steele rolled to his feet, his rifle lost in the fall, and drew his sidearm. The 2 men faced each other in the pouring rain, 20 feet apart, both breathing hard. "You can't stop this, McCree," Steele gasped, blood streaming from his shoulder wound. Blackwood owns half the territory. Even if the boy talks, who's going to believe him? Maybe nobody, Silas admitted. But I'll make sure they hear the story. You're a dead man walking. Blackwood has men everywhere. You'll never make it out of the territory alive. Maybe not, but I've been dead inside for 3 years anyway. Might as well make it count for something. Steele raised his gun, but Silas was faster. His shot took the gunman's center mass, and Steele crumpled to the ground, his weapon falling into the mud. As the echoes of gunfire faded, Silas heard Mrs. Henderson calling weakly from the river. He waded in and pulled her to safety, her broken leg making her cry out in pain. "Timothy," she gasped. He's safe. He's heading for town." "The papers," she whispered urgently. "James hid the papers in the old mine." Shaft number 7 in Deadwood Gulch. Evidence. Everything Blackwood did. She lost consciousness then, but she was breathing. Silas lifted her carefully and began the long walk back to town, his mind racing. The boy was safe, the evidence existed, and Blackwood's men were dead. But as he walked through the storm, carrying the unconscious woman, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was just beginning. Men like Cornelius Blackwood didn't build empires by giving up easily. And somewhere in the darkness, more eyes were watching. Dawn broke gray and sullen over Deadwood, the storm finally exhausted after its night of fury. The Black Hills River had receded, leaving behind a landscape of mud, debris, and destruction. Silas sat on the porch of Doc Morrison's clinic, his clothes still damp, watching the town slowly come back to life. Inside, Mrs. Henderson was recovering from her broken leg, and Timothy was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Deputy Brennan approached, his face grim. "McCree, we got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind that wears expensive suits and has the territorial governor on speed dial. Cornelius Blackwood rode into town an hour ago with a dozen men. He's asking questions about what happened last night." Silas stood, checking his gun out of habit. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest he knows his boys are dead. He's claiming you murdered 3 innocent men who were trying to help with flood rescue." "And you believe him?" Brennan spat into the mud. "Hell no. But belief and proof are 2 different things. Timothy's just a scared kid, and Mrs. Henderson's still unconscious, without evidence." "There is evidence," Silas said. "Mrs. Henderson told me before she passed out. James Henderson hid documents in shaft number 7 up in Deadwood Gulch. Everything Blackwood's been doing, the payroll robberies, the insurance fraud, all of it. That's a 2-hour ride from here, and Blackwood's not going to just let us waltz up there and collect evidence against him." As if summoned by their conversation, Cornelius Blackwood himself appeared at the end of the street. He was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that missed nothing. His expensive black suit was immaculate despite the muddy conditions, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his life. Behind him walked 6 armed men, all wearing the same hard expression of professional killers. "Mr. McCree," Blackwood called out as he approached, "I believe we need to have a conversation." "I'm listening." Blackwood smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "My men tell me there was some trouble last night. 3 of my employees were found dead near the river, shot down in cold blood from what I can see. Your employees were trying to murder a child and an old woman. That's a serious accusation. Do you have any proof?" Silas felt the familiar weight of his Colt at his hip. "The boy heard everything. Your man Steele confessed to killing James Henderson. The word of a traumatized child against respected members of the community?" Blackwood shook his head sadly. "I'm afraid that won't hold up in any court. Maybe not, but it'll be enough to get people asking questions. Questions can be discouraged. Children can be relocated. Accidents happen, Mr. McCree, especially to men who don't know when to mind their own business." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Silas was aware of the townspeople gathering at a safe distance, watching the confrontation unfold. He could see fear in their faces, fear of Blackwood's power, fear of what would happen if they chose the wrong side. "Here's what's going to happen," Blackwood continued. "You're going to leave town today. Right now, in fact. You're going to take that boy with you, and you're both going to disappear. Permanently. And if I refuse, then I'll have you arrested for murder. I have 6 witnesses who will swear you gunned down 3 innocent men. The territorial judge is a personal friend of mine. You'll hang within a week." Silas looked around at the faces of the townspeople. He could see the resignation there, the acceptance that this was just how things worked. Men like Blackwood had all the power, and ordinary folks just had to live with whatever scraps of justice they were allowed. But then he saw Timothy's face in the clinic window, pressed against the glass, watching everything. The boy's green eyes were full of hope and trust, the same look Sarah had given him 3 years ago, before he'd failed her. "Deputy," Silas said quietly, "how long would it take to ride to shaft number 7 and back? 2 hours each way. Maybe 3 in this mud. And how long can you keep Blackwood busy here in town?" Brennan's eyes widened as he understood. "McCree, that's suicide. He's got men everywhere." "Maybe. But that boy in there deserves better than running and hiding for the rest of his life." Blackwood had been listening to their exchange with growing impatience. "I'm done playing games, McCree. You have 10 minutes to get out of my town or what?" Silas interrupted. "You'll have me killed like you had James Henderson killed? Like you tried to have his family killed?" The accusation rang out across the street, and Silas saw several townspeople exchange glances. Seeds of doubt planted in fertile ground. "That's enough," Blackwood snapped. "Boys, arrest this man for murder." But as his men moved forward, something unexpected happened. Doc Morrison stepped out of his clinic, followed by the town's preacher, then the school teacher, then a dozen other citizens. They formed a loose circle around Silas, not armed, but present. "Now hold on there, Blackwood," Doc Morrison said. "This man risked his life to save Margaret Henderson and her grandson. I've heard the boy's story, and it's got the ring of truth to it. The word of a child. The word of a child is worth more than the word of a man who's been bleeding this town dry for years," the preacher interrupted. "We've all wondered about those convenient payroll robberies. Mighty strange how they always happened when you were conveniently out of town." Blackwood's face flushed red with anger. "You people don't know what you're doing. I own this town. I own all of you." "Maybe you did," said a new voice. Sheriff Morrison pushed through the crowd, his badge gleaming in the morning light. "But I just got back from a very interesting ride up to Deadwood Gulch." He held up a leather satchel, bulging with papers. "Found this right where Mrs. Henderson said it would be. Seems James Henderson was a very thorough bookkeeper. Every robbery, every insurance claim, every bribe, it's all here in black and white." The color drained from Blackwood's face. "Those documents are forgeries. Henderson was a disgruntled employee, with handwriting samples that match your personal correspondence," the sheriff continued, "and witness statements from 3 of your former employees who were willing to talk once they heard Henderson was dead." Blackwood's hand moved toward his gun, but Silas was ready. His Colt appeared in his hand like magic, the barrel aimed directly at Blackwood's heart. "I wouldn't," Silas said quietly. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other. Then Blackwood's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Sheriff Morrison," Silas said, never taking his eyes off Blackwood, "I believe you have some arrests to make." As the sheriff moved in with his handcuffs, Timothy burst out of the clinic and ran to Silas, throwing his small arms around the gunfighter's waist. "You kept your promise," the boy said, tears streaming down his face. "You saved us all." Silas knelt down to the boy's level, his own eyes suspiciously wet. "Sometimes, son, the only way to stop running from the past is to stand and fight for the future." As Blackwood was led away in chains, Silas realized that for the first time in 3 years, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He couldn't bring Sarah back, couldn't undo his failures as a father, but he could make sure Timothy Henderson grew up in a world where justice meant something. And sometimes, that was enough. "Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often."